The prairie had turned to liquid. Summer rain hammered the open ground outside Drought Creek, filling every hollow with brown water that surged and pooled until the land itself seemed to dissolve. Thunder rolled across the flats in waves that shook a man's ribs, and the sky hung so low and gray, it pressed down like the lid of a coffin waiting to close. Lakota warrior Nayati, riding back from a scouting job for the Indian Agency, almost passed the sound, at first a thin, ragged cry swallowed by the storm. He had been thinking about the agency superintendent's questions, about the talk of new rail lines cutting through treaty land, about the slow erosion of promises made in writing and broken in practice. The rain had turned his thoughts inward, and he had not expected to find anything human out here in the open miles from the nearest homestead. He reined in a water streaming from the brim of his hat and listened. Another sob came high and cracking, a child's lungs straining against the cold. He swung off the trail toward a low swale where hoof prints sank to the fetlocks and vanished in the churning mud. There, under the hard silver lines of the rain, 7 children sat huddled together in the muckbacks, pressed against one another, arms wrapped around thin knees. Their clothes were drenched rags, torn and filthy. One boy's lips were blue. A little girl shivered so hard, her teeth clicked like dice in a tin cup. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, held a toddler against her chest, her thin arms locked around the child as if she would never let go. A few yards behind them, a dark-haired woman staggered forward. She reached toward the children's boots sliding in the soup of mud and grass. The ground turned treacherous under her, and she went down face first in a puddle did not move. Rain pounded her back, turning the water around her pink. Nayati splashed through the muck lantern, banging against his thigh. He dropped to one knee beside the woman. Long hair plastered to his shoulders, rain streaming off the beaded fringe of his buckskin shirt. With one hand, he kept the lantern high so its glow cut through the gray. With the other, he felt along her throat. A pulse trembled there, faint but steady. He looked up at the nearest girl, the one holding the toddler. "Is she your mother?" he asked. The girl nodded once, water dripping from her nose. A crack of lightning lit them all, the warrior kneeling in the mud, the limp woman sprawled half in a puddle. 7 children shivering in the rain. And beyond them, the swale filling, slowly turning into a shallow rising grave. Nayati did not waste time. He hauled the woman up under her arms, slinging her weight across his shoulder, and turned to the children. "Get up," he said. "All of you. Now." They obeyed without question, scrambling to their feet on legs that barely held them. The oldest girl shifted the toddler to her hip and grabbed the smallest boy's hand. The others formed a ragged line, clinging to one another. "Follow me," Nayati said. "Stay close." He led them out of the swale, every step a fight against the sucking mud. Twice the smallest boy fell, and Nayati had to stop and haul him up. Once the woman's head lolled back, and he thought she had stopped breathing. But when he pressed his ear to her chest, he heard the faint thump of her heart, stubborn and determined. They reached higher ground, just as the swale behind them began to overflow, brown water spilling across the grass like a slow, hungry mouth. He led them toward a thin stand of cottonwoods on a slight rise where Lakota traders sometimes camped when they brought hides into Drought Creek. The trees offered scant shelter, but it was better than the open prairie. There he strung a piece of oilcloth from his pack between 2 trunks, low and tight to blunt the rain. He scraped out a shallow hollow in the ground with his knife and coaxed a grudging fire from damp kindling, cupping it in his palms until it caught and held. Under the weak shelter, the children stared at him, at his braids, at the bone and shell beads on his shirt, at the knife on his belt, with a mixture of fear and raw hope. He handed out strips of dried meat from his pouch, tore one in half so the smallest boys could share. They ate without speaking, teeth, chattering eyes, never leaving his face. The woman did not wake. Her skin felt like cold clay, and her breath stuttered in her chest. Her lips had gone pale, nearly blue. Nayati stripped off her soaked outer dress, leaving the plain shift beneath, and wrapped her in his heavy blanket, then moved the lantern close enough that its heat touched her face. He knew the line between life and death in weather like this. He had watched Lakota elders and children slip over it during winter marches after the Great Sioux War had carried his own little sister's body to a grave, dug in frozen ground when he was 16. Winona had been 8 years old, small for her age, and she had died of cold and hunger on the third day of a forced march. He had wrapped her in his own coat, but it had not been enough. Those memories hissed in his chest as loud as the rain. At first light, he would have to take this group into Drought Creek to Dr. Nathaniel Crane, the town's only physician, and Miss Lucille Hart, the schoolteacher who owed nobody in town except her students. But going in with 7 white children and an unconscious immigrant woman himself, a Lakota scout distrusted by half the settlers and barely tolerated by the other half, meant stepping straight into the jaws of whatever trouble had driven them onto the prairie in the first place. He fed the fire and watched the woman's breathing. Her fingers twitched in her sleep, clutching at something that was not there. The oldest girl sat beside him, the toddler asleep in her lap. "Are you going to leave us?" she asked quietly. Nayati looked at her. The girl's face was thin and hollow, too old for her years. He had seen that look before on children who had survived things no child should. It was the same look Winona had worn in those final days, a look that said hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. "No," he said. "Promise? I promise." She nodded, accepting his word without question, and leaned her head against his shoulder. He let her stay there, feeling the weight of her trust like a stone in his chest. It was a weight he had not carried since Winona died, and it terrified him more than any battle ever had. The night stretched long. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, then picked up again, then eased once more. Nayati dozed in fits, waking at every sound. Near midnight, one of the smaller boys cried out in his sleep, and Nayati moved quickly to quiet him, pressing a hand gently over the child's mouth until the nightmare passed. The boy's forehead was hot fever building. Nayati dampened a scrap of cloth from his canteen and pressed it to the child's skin, willing the fever to break. By dawn, the storm had thinned to a cold drizzle. The sky lightened from black to gray, but the sun did not break through. Evangeline jerked awake with a hoarse gasp, fighting the blanket as if it were a pair of hands. Nayati caught her wrists. "Easy," he said. "You are out of the mud. Your children are here." Her eyes, gray and sharp despite exhaustion, flicked from his face to the ring of makeshift cots, where the children slept, huddled together under scraps of cloth and oilcloth. Relief loosened her shoulders, and then fear slammed back in, harder than before. "The train," she rasped. "We have to keep them away from the train, from Ketchum's men." Bit by bit, between coughing fits, she told him. The children had come west on an orphan train, one of the charity initiatives that shipped homeless children from the crowded eastern cities to the frontier, where families were supposed to take them in and give them honest work and schooling. Evangeline had taken work as a cook and watcher on the train, hoping to stay close to her younger cousins and siblings after their parents died of fever back in New York. She had 4 siblings of her own among the group, plus 3 cousins. The journey west had taken 2 weeks, the children packed into rail cars with wooden benches and straw on the floor. At the Drought Creek Depot, cattle and mine baron William Barbed Wire Bill Ketchum had met the train with a sheaf of papers and a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a tall man in his 50s, broad-shouldered with silver hair and a fine wool coat that must have cost more than most men earned in a year. He claimed to run a home and employment agency, offering good wages and sturdy families for the children. But when the railroad men drank in the saloon, they called it Ketchum's Kid Company, and their jokes made Evangeline's stomach twist. She had overheard enough talk of small hands in tight seams of coal, of pretty ones, earning their keep in back rooms above saloons. She had tried to intervene to argue with the depot agent to demand proof of the families Ketchum claimed were waiting. Instead, freight handlers had shoved her aside and begun herding the children into separate stock cars like calves being sorted for market. When she had snatched the youngest back, a man had hit her with a rifle butt, splitting her scalp. Blood had run into her eyes. "In the confusion," she whispered, "they mixed up cards and names. I grabbed whoever I could reach and ran." She remembered clutching a torn page ripped from a freight ledger columns of names and ages, and a bold note in the margin, "All stock consigned to B.W. Ketchum Drought Creek Placement Agency." Somewhere in the chaos, she had lost that page to the mud. Nayati listened, jaw tightening. He knew Ketchum's name. Everyone in 3 days' ride did. The man had come west with money from Chicago rail investors and had bought up cattle range freight contracts and water rights until half the territory depended on his goodwill. Owning the cattle range had not been enough. Now the man was buying mines freight contracts, political favors, and it seemed children. "We go to town," Nayati said. "The doctor and Miss Hart will stand with you. The law must see this." Evangeline's laugh was bitter. The law signed the papers that put those children in his hands. Then we make the law see what it signed. He helped her to her feet. She swayed and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. For a moment their eyes met, and he saw something in her face that was not gratitude, but recognition, and the look of someone who had also learned that promises were cheap and survival was earned. The oldest girl woke and sat up, the toddler still clutched in her arms. "I am Lottie," she said. "This is Samuel. The others are Franklin, Celia, Mildred, Owen, and Jacob." "Evangeline Marchand," the woman said, then nodded at Nayati. "And you are Nayati." "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded and began packing the camp. As he rolled the oilcloth, he watched Evangeline move among the children, checking each one, touching foreheads for fever, murmuring reassurances. Despite her own exhaustion and injury, she moved with the efficiency of a woman who had cared for too many for too long. It reminded him of his mother in the days before the soldiers came. The path to town meant crossing the river. The journey took longer than it should have. Evangeline could barely walk, and the children stumbled with exhaustion. Nayati put her on his pony with Samuel and Jacob, the two smallest, while the rest walked. Every 100 yards, he had to stop and let them rest. Franklin, trying to be brave, kept his chin up, but limped badly on a twisted ankle. Lottie carried Mildred on her back for stretches, her thin legs trembling with the effort. The morning was cold, despite the season, the kind of cold that came after heavy rain. Mist rose from the prairie in thin columns, and the air smelled of wet sage and mud. Hours of rain had turned the usually mild ford into a churning band of brown water 30 yards wide. The wagon bridge, built of rough timber and held together with iron spikes and prayer, shuddered as whole trees slammed against its pilings, the impacts booming like cannon fire. Nayati studied the bridge carefully before approaching. The water was higher than he had ever seen it, and several of the support beams showed cracks. But there was no other way across for miles, and the children could not walk that far. "Stay close together," he told them. "Hold the rails. Do not look down." He put Evangeline on his pony, the smallest 2 children behind her, and led the animal onto the bridge, while the older ones walked in a tight line. Wind clawed at them, threatening to tear the children's fingers from the railings. Franklin held Jacob's hand so hard the little boy whimpered, but Franklin did not let go. The bridge groaned beneath them, timbers flexing with each step. Halfway across, a massive tree trunk struck one of the pilings with a boom that shook the entire structure. The pony danced sideways, hooves slipping on wet planks. Evangeline grabbed for the mane, her injured hands barely strong enough to hold on. Then another impact closer, and a floating log as thick as a man's body bounced upward, slamming into the pony's legs. The horse reared front hooves, scraping air eyes, rolling white with terror. Evangeline began to slide sideways, and Samuel screamed. Nayati lunged, grabbing the back of her belt with both hands. For a heartbeat, his boots skidded on the flooding planks, and he felt empty air under his heels, the river roaring below like a living thing hungry for flesh. The weight of Evangeline and 2 children pulled him forward, and his chest hit the rail hard enough to knock the breath from him. Then Franklin was there, small hands grabbing Nayati's belt, bracing him. Lottie seized the pony's bridle, speaking to the animal in a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the panic. The horse settled shaking, and Evangeline found her grip on the mane. Nayati hauled her upright, and they staggered the rest of the way across in silence, each step a prayer. When they reached solid ground, Evangeline slid from the pony and fell to her knees, retching. The children gathered around her, and she pulled them close, counting heads with shaking hands. All 7. Still alive. Nayati stood apart watching. Franklin came to stand beside him, the boy's face pale but set. "Thank you," Franklin said quietly, "for not letting her fall." "Thank you for holding me," Nayati answered, meeting the boy's eyes. "You saved us all." Franklin nodded, something like pride flickering across his exhausted face. They pushed into Drought Creek, soaked, stumbling, and silent. Drought Creek was a small town, a single wide street flanked by clapboard buildings with false fronts that tried to look grander than they were. The general store, the saloon, the assay office, the church, with its whitewashed steeple. At the end of the street stood Dr. Crane's office, a tidy building with green shutters and a sign that read N. Crane, physician and surgeon, in careful black letters. Dr. Nathaniel Crane, a wiry man in his 50s, with spectacles perched on a long nose and hands steady as stone, did not waste time with questions when he saw Evangeline's color. He stripped off her wet clothes behind a curtain, bundled her in blankets near his cast-iron stove, and rubbed her arms until pins and needles brought angry red back to her skin. Chilled clear through, he muttered, checking her pulse. Another hour in that storm, and she would have been past my help. He worked with the efficiency of a man who had seen too much death to waste time. He cleaned the cut on her scalp where the rifle butt had split the skin, stitching it closed with neat, careful stitches. She did not cry out, only bit her lip until blood came. Across the dirt street, Miss Lucille Hart opened the schoolhouse early. She was a tall woman in her 30s, plain-spoken and unafraid, with dark hair pinned in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had come west to teach after her fiancé died of consumption back in Ohio. She stoked the schoolhouse stove until it roared, handed out rough wool blankets, and poured hot chicory into tin cups for the children. The schoolhouse was a single large room with rows of wooden benches, a blackboard at the front, and windows that looked out onto the muddy street. Maps hung on the walls, territories marked in fading ink boundaries that shifted with every treaty and every broken promise. The children huddled close to the stove, steam rising from their damp clothes. "You are safe for now," Lucille said, though one glance through the window at the saloon across the way told her the word safe was a thin thing in Drought Creek. Already Ketchum's riders were gathering on the boardwalk, watching. Muddy boots, rain-slick hats, revolvers on their hips. Men who worked for wages and did not ask questions. Among them stood Muddy Boots, Harlan Ketchum's foreman, a heavy-set man with a face like a slab of uncooked beef and small, cruel eyes. Nayati stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, rain dripping from his hat brim, and met their stares. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, a silent line between the children and the street. Harlan spat tobacco juice into the mud and turned away. But the message had been delivered. Ketchum knew where his stock had gone. Inside, the children sat close together on the benches, wrapped in blankets, sipping the hot chicory. Lottie held Samuel in her lap, rocking him gently. Franklin sat apart, staring at his hands. Nayati noticed that the boy's knuckles were raw, scraped bloody, as if he had been hitting something hard. Lucille moved among them, checking each child with quiet competence. She knelt beside Owen, a quiet boy of about 9, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed too old for his face. Around his neck hung a small carved wooden bird on a leather cord worn smooth by handling. "That is a beautiful carving," Lucille said gently. "Where did you get it?" Owen's fingers closed around it. "My mother made it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "before she died." Lucille nodded and moved on, but Nayati saw the way the boy clutched that bird, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath him. Dr. Crane came in a few minutes later, drying his hands on a towel. "She will live," he said, "but she needs rest, a few days at least." "We do not have a few days," Evangeline said from the doorway. She had followed him, wrapped in a blanket, face pale but determined. "Ketchum will come for them." "Let him," Lucille said quietly. "We have witnesses now. We have you. We can fight this." "You do not know him," Evangeline said. "He has the law on his side. He has money. He has men with guns." "And we have the truth," Lucille answered. "That has to count for something." Evangeline looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I hope you are right." But her eyes said she did not believe it. By afternoon, Marshal Frederick "Feeble Fred" Jenkins walked up to the schoolhouse with 2 deputies. Jenkins was a decent man, worn down by years of trying to enforce the law in a town where the law bent to whoever paid the most. Behind him came Muddy Boots, Harlan carrying folded papers sealed with red wax. "The Drought Creek Placement Agency has legal guardianship," Harlan announced from the doorway, eyes sweeping over the cots where the children sat huddled. "Those orphans were taken off our train without authorization. We are here to reclaim them." Lucille stepped between the men and the children. "They are sick and some are half frozen," she said, voice firm but not loud. "They are not cattle you can weigh and drag back into a freight car." Marshal Jenkins shifted his weight, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Papers look proper, Miss Hart. Judge in Iron Mountain stamped them. Says Ketchum's agency is authorized to place children for work and adoption across 3 counties. Nayati, leaning against the back wall, straightened. "Work in his mine," he said quietly. "Work in his saloon." "That is slander." Harlan snapped fingers, brushing the butt of his pistol. "You want to say that again, Indian?" Tension stretched the room tight as a bowstring. A child coughed. Another began to cry. Dr. Crane shouldered through the doorway behind the men's medical bag in hand. "You haul any of these young ones out into the rain," he said, meeting Harlan's eyes, "and some of them will die before morning. That will sit on your conscience, Marshal. And on your ledger, Harlan." Harlan's jaw worked. He glanced at Jenkins, then back at the children. One of them, Celia, stared at him with huge eyes, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around her. For a moment, something flickered in Harlan's face. Not quite sympathy, but something close to discomfort. "You get one night," he growled finally. "Tomorrow they ride back under our protection. Any interference and we press charges for kidnapping." He turned and walked out. Jenkins lingered a moment, looking at Evangeline. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you have proof of wrongdoing, you need to bring it forward, officially. Otherwise, my hands are tied." "I had proof," she said. "A page from their ledger. I lost it in the mud." Jenkins sighed. Then get more, because right now the law says those children belong to Ketchum's agency. He left, and the room fell silent. That night was long and tense. The children slept fitfully, waking at every sound. Evangeline sat by the stove, unable to rest, watching over them like a hawk. Lucille brought food from her own kitchen-bred cheese apples, and the children ate with the desperate hunger of those who had gone too long without. Near midnight, Franklin, who had not slept at all, heard the scrape of a window sash being lifted. A gloved hand slipped through the gap, groping for Celia's blanket where she slept on the floor. Franklin reacted on instinct, clamping both hands around the wrist and yanking hard. The man crashed half into the room, cursing in a low, harsh voice. Celia screamed. Nayati was already moving. He drove his shoulder into the intruder's chest, slamming him to the floor. The man fired once in panic. The bullet shattered a slate board instead of a skull, filling the air with chalk dust and the sharp smell of gunpowder. He wriggled free in the confusion and tumbled out into the alley, leaving a smear of blood on the sill where the broken glass had cut him. Nayati leaned out the window, watching the man disappear into the dark. "More of Ketchum's kindness," he said, checking the latch. "He means to have them whether the sun rises or not." Evangeline, wrapped in a blanket, knelt beside Franklin and checked his hands for cuts. "You are brave," she said softly. "I am scared," Franklin answered, voice shaking. "Brave and scared are the same thing," she told him, echoing words her own mother had told her years ago. "Brave just means you do not let the scared stop you." Franklin nodded, but his hands still shook. Evangeline pulled him close, and after a moment the boy leaned into her, letting himself be held. Nayati stood by the window, staring out into the dark. Lucille came to stand beside him. "They will come back," she said quietly. "I know. What do we do?" He was silent for a long moment. "We fight," he said finally. "But we need evidence. Something that will make the law listen." "There is one place," Lucille said. "The telegraph office. If we can reach it before Ketchum's men, we can send word to the territorial capital." Nayati nodded. "Then we go at first light." There was one lever the Baron did not fully control: the telegraph. At dawn, Evangeline insisted on riding with Nayati to the tiny telegraph shack at Lazy Susan, citing a 2-hour ride north. Her legs still shook, but her eyes were steady. The morning was cold and clear, the storm finally spent. Mist rose from the prairie in thin columns that the rising sun turned to gold. The air smelled of wet sage and new grass, clean and sharp. They rode in silence for the first hour, Evangeline on Nayati's pony and Nayati walking beside her, leading the animal. The world felt washed clean, reborn, as if the storm had scoured away more than just dirt. "You do not have to do this," he said, finally breaking the silence. "You could rest. Let me handle it. They are my responsibility." She answered, her voice hoarse but firm. "I told their parents I would keep them safe. I will not break that promise. You did not know what Ketchum was. I should have." Her hands tightened on the reins. "I saw the way he looked at them. Like they were merchandise. I should have known. Knowing and being able to stop it are different things." She was quiet for a moment, staring at the horizon. "Is that what you tell yourself about your sister?" He stopped walking. The question hit him like a physical blow. "How do you know about that? You said her name in your sleep last night. Winona." He stood still, jaw tight, the old grief rising in his throat like bile. Then he started walking again, faster now, as if he could outpace the memory. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough. "That is what I tell myself. It does not help." "No," she agreed softly. "It does not." They walked in silence after that, But it was a different kind of silence, not uncomfortable, but shared. The silence of two people who had both carried losses too heavy to name and had learned that sometimes the only company worth having was someone who understood that words could not fix everything. They reached Lazy Susan siding as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist. The telegraph shack was a small wooden building beside the tracks, barely big enough for one man and the telegraph machine. The operator, a nervous young man named Owen, no relation to the boy, tapped out their message with pale knuckles, glancing at the door, as if expecting Ketchum's men to burst in at any moment. The message was long and expensive, addressed to the territorial judge in Iron Mountain. It accused Ketchum's agency of turning orphan-trained children into forced labor, cited the names of the 7 children, described the conditions at the depot, and requested an immediate investigation. Evangeline dictated it carefully, choosing each word to be as clear and damning as possible. Nayati stood by the door, watching the road, his rifle within easy reach. When it was done, the operator handed them the receipt. "This will take a day or two to get a reply," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning. "If you get one at all. And ma'am, you should know Ketchum sends messages through here regular. He has friends in Iron Mountain." "Then we hope his friends value the law more than his money," Evangeline said. They rode back to Drought Creek in silence, both knowing that time was running out. As they approached the town, Nayati saw smoke rising from the schoolhouse chimney and felt a small measure of relief. At least the children were warm. But when they entered the schoolhouse, Lucille's face told them everything they needed to know. The reply came faster than expected, she said, holding out a telegram. Her hand shook slightly. "It is not good." 2 days had passed while they waited, 2 days of tension and fear. The children had barely left the schoolhouse, too afraid to venture outside. Dr. Crane had come twice a day to check on them, bringing food and medicine. But now the answer had arrived, and Marshal Jenkins read it aloud, while Lucille, Nayati, Evangeline, and the children listened in crushing silence. According to records in Iron Mountain and correspondence with the Orphan Train Society in New York, everything Ketchum had done was perfectly legal. The society, overwhelmed by the sheer number of homeless children in the eastern cities, had signed a general placement agreement with the Drought Creek Placement Agency, authorizing Ketchum to take full charge of all children delivered on Train 47, in exchange for promises of housing work and schooling. The contract included a clause releasing the society from liability for conditions after placement. The judge's tone, even in clipped telegraph phrases, was clear. The law recognized Ketchum as legal guardian for every child on that train until further evidence of abuse arose. And evidence, the judge noted, required sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, physical proof of harm, and documentation, none of which could be gathered while the children remained in Drought Creek under the protection of unauthorized parties. Evangeline stared at the copy of the contract, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. "Those signatures," she whispered. "They are from people back east who thought they were doing good. They thought they were saving these children." Lottie, who had been sitting quietly with Samuel in her lap, looked from the paper to Evangeline, then to Nayati. Her young face was pale, drawn, aged beyond her years by fear and exhaustion. "You promised you would keep us together." The girl said, her voice raw with betrayal and despair. "Now he owns us, same as he owns his mine." The words hit harder than any blow, because they were not spoken in anger, but in the flat, defeated tone of someone who had learned not to hope. Evangeline flinched as if struck. "Lottie," she began. "You promised." Lottie repeated, and then she turned away, pressing her face against Samuel's hair so no one could see her cry. The machinery of charity, twisted by greed, had given Ketchum everything he needed to turn children into property. with that single telegram hope of a clean legal victory, evaporated like morning mist. If Nayati or Evangeline tried to run with the children, now they could be branded kidnappers and hunted down. Ketchum had turned the very system meant to save these children into a weapon against them. That afternoon, while Evangeline sat with the children and Nayati kept watch, Dr. Crane and Lucille dug through old files in the doctor's office. They pulled medical notes, casualty reports from Coal Creek, and copies of telegrams the operator had secretly kept messages Ketchum had sent over the past year about replacement labor, lost stock, and illness among placements. "This is not one bad shipment," Lucille said, spreading the papers on the table in Crane's examination room. "This is a system. He has been doing this for years." Dr. Crane was quiet, staring at the papers with an expression Lucille could not quite read. His hands, normally so steady, shook slightly as he sorted through the documents. "Nathaniel," she said, "are you all right?" He looked up, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Shame so deep, it was almost physical, bending his shoulders, aging him before her eyes. "I knew," he said quietly. "Not all of it, but I knew some of it." Lucille stared at him, her stomach going cold. "What are you saying?" He sat down heavily, as if his legs would no longer hold him. 2 years ago, Ketchum came to me. He said he was placing orphans with families in the territory, and he needed a doctor to certify them fit for work and travel. Standard procedure, he said. He paid me $20 per certificate, good money for 10 minutes of work. I thought it was legitimate. "You signed papers without checking where the children went." Lucille's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were hard. "I checked the first few," he said, his voice breaking. "I visited families, saw the children settled. Then it became routine. I trusted him. The money was good, and I told myself I was helping these children get placed faster, keeping them from languishing in orphanages." He looked down at his hands. "By the time I realized what he was actually doing, where most of them were really going, I was already complicit. If I spoke up, I would lose my license. Maybe go to jail. The certificates I had signed were legal documents. I could be charged as an accessory." "So you stayed silent," Lucille said. It was not a question. "Yes." The word came out like a confession in church. "I stayed silent, and children suffered and died because of it." The room was deathly quiet. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Someone shouted a greeting. Normal life, continuing oblivious. "Why are you telling me this now?" Lucille asked finally. "Because I can't stay silent anymore." He pushed the stack of papers toward her with shaking hands. "These are my notes. Every child I examined for Ketchum over the past 2 years, every injury I treated and did not report, every time I suspected something was wrong and looked the other way. It is all here. Names, dates, my signatures. If it helps convict him, use it. And if it convicts me too, so be it." Lucille looked at the papers, months of meticulous records damning in their detail, then at the man who had kept them. Dr. Crane had always been respected in Drought Creek, trusted, even liked. This would destroy him utterly. "This will ruin you," she said. "I know. You will lose everything." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "But those children might live. That has to be worth more than my reputation." Lucille gathered the papers carefully, her mind already working through how to use them. "Then we use it," she said. "All of it." They pressed the documents into Nayati's hands that night after the children had fallen into exhausted sleep. "Bring them back if you can," Crane said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "If you cannot bring this ledger trail to someone who will listen, someone with more authority than a territorial judge who signs papers without reading them. Nayati took the papers and tucked them carefully inside his shirt next to his skin where they would stay dry. "I will bring them back," he said, meeting Crane's eyes. "All of them. I give you my word." "Your word." Crane said, his voice hollow with self-loathing, "is worth more than mine ever was." That night, while most of Drought Creek slept, Nayati slipped out of town. The moon was nearly full, turning the prairie to silver and shadow. He moved quietly, a ghost in the darkness, following the wagon ruts that led east toward Coal Creek, where Ketchum owned 2 mines and a string of bunkhouses for his workers and for the children he had claimed. His younger kinsman, Tasunke, was waiting at the arranged spot, a stand of cottonwoods a mile from town. The young man materialized from the shadows. Like smoke, his movements fluid and silent. "The wagons left this afternoon," Tasunke said without preamble. "Heading to Coal Creek. They have the children." Nayati's jaw tightened. "How many guards?" "6 riders, plus the drivers. They are not expecting trouble." "Then we give them some." They rode through the night, keeping to the high ground where they could see without being seen. The trail was clear even in the moonlight, deep ruts from the wagon's hoofprints, the occasional piece of discarded trash. Twice they had to circle wide to avoid settlements. Once they passed so close to a ranch house that they could hear a dog barking, but the animal was chained and could not follow. Near dawn they reached a narrow canyon where the trail bottomed out near a creek. Tasunke pointed to fresh tracks in the mud. "They camped here," he said. "Left maybe 2 hours ago." Nayati studied the ground. "They are moving slow. The children are slowing them down." "Good," Tasunke said grimly. "That gives us time." They pushed on as the sun rose, painting the canyon walls gold and red. The heat built quickly, turning the air to shimmer and haze. By midday, they spotted the wagons in the distance, moving at a crawl along the canyon floor. And then, as they crested a ridge, they saw Coal Creek spread out below them. Coal Creek crouched in a narrow canyon, half hidden by the shadows of steep rock walls. It was not a town so much as a collection of rough buildings clustered around the black mouth of a mine. Bunkhouses with tar paper roofs, an equipment shed, a long, low building that might have been an office or a saloon or both. The creek itself ran fast and loud through the middle of it all, foaming brown with runoff from higher ground. Nayati and Tasunke watched from cover as the wagons rolled into the camp. Men came out to meet them, rough-looking miners and guards, dirty and tired. Ketchum himself was there, tall and well-dressed, standing apart from his men like a general surveying his troops. The children were unloaded roughly hands, grabbing them and pushing them toward the bunkhouses. Evangeline was dragged from one of the wagons, her hands bound in front of her. Nayati saw her stumble and nearly fall. Saw Harlan grab her arm and haul her upright, shoving her toward a separate building. "We cannot take them all tonight," Tasunke whispered. "Too many guards. Too many guns." "We do not need to take them all," Nayati said, his mind working fast. "We take 1 or 2, make enough noise that Ketchum knows we are here. Make him afraid. And then we go back for help, with proof that they are here and alive." What Nayati saw next through the gap in a bunkhouse wall made his blood run cold. 2 men led a boy out of one of the buildings, not one of the Marchand children, but another boy older, perhaps 14, thin as a rail with hollow eyes and hands wrapped in dirty bandages. They gave him a pickaxe and a candle and led him toward the mine entrance. The boy went without argument, shoulders slumped as if he had done this 100 times before, and knew that resistance was useless. Nayati waited, watching the rhythms of the camp. Guards changed shifts. Men came and went from the mine. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting pools of yellow light that left deep shadows between the buildings. And then Ketchum did something strange. He walked to the bunkhouse where the Marchand children had been taken, spoke briefly to one of the guards, and pointed at one of the children inside Owen, the quiet boy with the wooden bird around his neck. The guard went in and brought Owen out. The boy looked terrified, but Ketchum knelt down in front of him, staring at the child's face with an intensity that was almost painful to watch. Then Ketchum reached out and touched the wooden bird hanging around Owen's neck. His hand trembled. His face went white. "Get him a blanket," Ketchum said to the guard, his voice strange and thick. "And food. Good food, not the slop you give the others. He sleeps in the office tonight, not the bunkhouse." The guard looked confused. "Boss, I thought—" "Do it." Ketchum snapped. Then more quietly, "Do it now." The guard shrugged and obeyed. Owen was led away to the office building, looking back at the bunkhouse where the other children were being locked in his young face, confused and frightened. Nayati filed that away, not understanding it, but knowing it mattered. As full dark fell, he and Tasunke crept closer to the bunkhouse where most of the children were being held. Through a crack in the wall, Nayati could see them huddled together on the floor. Lottie with Samuel in her arms, Franklin sitting with his back straight, despite exhaustion, trying to be brave. Celia, Mildred, Jacob, all of them there, except Owen. Nayati tapped lightly on the wall. Lottie turned, saw his eye through the crack, and her face flooded with hope and relief. She mouthed one word, "Help." But before he could respond, a hand clamped on his shoulder, and the cold circle of a revolver barrel pressed against the base of his skull. "Well, well," a voice drawled. "Looks like the warrior followed his stock all the way home." They dragged him into the main building at gunpoint to Sunki, fighting and cursing until a rifle butt to the stomach doubled him over. The interior was rough plank floors, a few tables, an iron stove in the corner. Ketchum sat at a desk, counting money stacks of coins and paper scrip laid out in neat rows. Ledgers were open in front of him, columns of figures tracking profits and losses. The Baron looked up as they shoved Nayati through the door. He did not seem surprised. "Sit," Ketchum said, gesturing to a chair. Nayati did not sit. Two guards held his arms, but his eyes never left Ketchum's face. The Baron sighed and stood walking around the desk. Up close, he was older than he looked. From a distance, lines around his eyes, gray threading through his hair hands marked with old scars. He had not always been a man who bought and sold children. Once maybe he had been something else. "Here is how this works. Warrior B-ner." Ketchum said, his voice calm and businesslike. "Those children are mine by law. That woman is here to answer questions about theft and interference. You and your friend, on the other hand, have no legal standing at all. You are trespassing on private property armed at night. I could have you shot, and no court would bat an eye." "Then why talk?" Nayati asked. "Because I am a businessman, not a murderer." Ketchum spread his hands. "I want you to take a message back to Drought Creek. Tell the good doctor and the school teacher that this matter is settled. Tell them that if they continue to interfere, I will press charges for kidnapping and conspiracy, and they will hang. Tell them those children are safe, well-fed, and learning honest trades. And tell them—" He paused, something flickering across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. "Tell them that some children are more valuable than others." He finished quietly. "And that value must be protected. The boy you sent into the mine tonight is being protected." Nayati said, his voice hard with contempt. Ketchum's jaw tightened. "That boy is learning what the world demands. Work, obedience, strength. I am preparing him for survival. By breaking him. By making him useful." Ketchum's voice rose slightly. This territory does not suffer the weak or the useless. You of all people should understand that, warrior. Your people learned that lesson hard. These children will learn it too, one way or another. I am simply choosing the method. Nayati took a step forward despite the guns. You are killing them. I am saving them from slower deaths. Ketchum's control was cracking now, anger bleeding through. You think those children have futures back east in orphanages and almshouses, dying of disease and neglect. Here they have work, purpose, a place. In your mine, in your rooms above the saloon, doing what must be done to survive. Ketchum's hand slammed down on the desk. I did not make this world, warrior. I just learned how to live in it. And now I am teaching them the same. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the hiss of the lantern. Then Nayati said quietly, "You want me to leave, fine. But first tell me about the boy, the one you moved to your office." Owen. Ketchum went very still. That is none of your concern. You gave him special treatment, better food, a better bed. Why? That is my business. It became my business when you locked him in a separate room. Nayati studied the Baron's face, seeing the tension there, the way his hand had unconsciously moved toward his chest, where something bulged beneath his shirt. What are you hiding? Ketchum's control snapped. Get out, he snarled. Get out now before I have you killed. Nayati held his ground a moment longer, memorizing every detail of the room, the layout, the positions of the guards, the location of the keys hanging on a nail by the door. Then he turned and walked out, Tasunke stumbling after him. Outside in the dark, once they were clear of the camp, Tasunke spat blood and said, "What now?" "Now," Nayati said grimly, "we go back to Drought Creek, get help, and find out what Ketchum is hiding about that boy." But even as he said it, he knew they were running out of time. Ketchum wasted no time. By the time Nayati and Tasunke reached Drought Creek the next afternoon, riding hard, pushing their horses to the edge of endurance, Ketchum's men had already been there. The wagons were parked outside the schoolhouse, and Harlan stood on the boardwalk with the legal documents in his hand, looking pleased with himself. Nayati's heart sank. Inside the scene was chaos. Lucille was arguing with Marshal Jenkins, her voice shaking with fury. Dr. Crane stood to one side, face gray with defeat. And in the center of it, all three children, Jacob, Celia, and Mildred, huddled together, crying. They took the others, Lucille said when she saw Nayati. Her eyes were red. 2 hours ago. Harlan came with papers from the judge, and Jenkins had no choice but to let them go. Where is Evangeline? They took her too. Said she was needed for questioning at Coal Creek. Lucille's hands clenched into fists. Nayati, they took Lottie and Franklin and Samuel. They took them all except these three. Why leave three? A show of good faith, Jenkins said bitterly from the doorway. Ketchum's words. He said he would return 3 children as a gesture of goodwill to prove he is not the monster we claim. The rest stay at Coal Creek until the territorial review is complete. And how long will that take? Months, maybe longer. Jenkins looked sick. I am sorry. I had no legal grounds to stop them. Nayati stood very still, rage and despair warring in his chest. Then he knelt down in front of the 3 children. Listen to me, he said quietly. Your brothers and sisters are still alive. I saw them, and I am going to bring them back. All of them. Do you understand? Jacob nodded, tears streaming down his face. Promise, I promise. It was the second time he had made that promise. This time he would keep it, or die trying. That night, a war council formed in the schoolhouse, after the children were asleep. Nayati, Tasunke, Lucille, Dr. Crane, and a handful of townspeople who had finally seen enough of a blacksmith named Tom. Two miners who had quit Ketchum's operation in disgust, a shopkeeper's wife named Mary, who had lost her own child to fever and would not stand by while others suffered. They spread out the documents Dr. Crane had given them, along with a rough map of Coal Creek that one of the ex-miners drew from memory. "The bunkhouse where they keep the children is here," the miner said, pointing. "Barred from the outside, 2 guards at night. The office where Ketchum sleeps is across the yard. The mine entrance is here and the creek runs between them." "The creek is our biggest problem," Tasunke said. "There is only one bridge, and it is the only way in or out of that canyon, unless you want to climb sheer rock walls." "Then we use the bridge," Nayati said. "It will be guarded." "I know." Nayati looked around the circle of faces. "This will be dangerous. Some of us may not come back. If anyone wants to leave, no one will think less of you." No one moved. "All right then," Nayati said. "We go tonight. We hit them fast, get the children out, and scatter before Ketchum can organize a pursuit." "And if the law comes after us?" Mary asked. "Then we worry about that later," Lucille said firmly. "Right now, those children need us." They rode out under cover of darkness, a dozen riders moving fast and quiet through the night. The moon was waning now, less than half full, which made them harder to see, but also made the trail harder to follow. They relied on Tasunki's memory and Nayati's skill at reading terrain in the dark. They reached Coal Creek well after midnight. The camp was mostly dark, only a few lanterns burning. Guards walked the perimeter, but their movements were lazy routine. They were not expecting trouble. Nayati divided the group. Half would create a distraction near the mine entrance. The other half would breach the bunkhouse and extract the children. Simple in theory. In practice, everything that could go wrong probably would. They moved into position in silence, communicating with hand signals. Nayati and Tasunke crept to the bunkhouse. The door was barred from the outside with a heavy timber. Nayati lifted it slowly, an inch at a time, holding his breath. Then chaos erupted on the far side of camp. Tom the blacksmith had been tasked with creating the distraction, and he did not disappoint. A controlled explosion near the equipment shed sent a fireball climbing into the night sky, and men shouting and running in confusion. Nayati jerked the bar free and flung the door open. Lottie was on her feet instantly, Franklin right behind her. "Go," Nayati said. "Now, run for the bridge." They ran, children and rescuers, both sprinting through the darkness, while behind them the camp dissolved into chaos. Gunfire crackled. Men shouted. Someone rang an alarm bell. They were halfway to the bridge when Harlan and 3 other guards cut them off, weapons drawn. "End of the line," Harlan said. There was genuine satisfaction in his voice. Nayati stepped forward, placing himself between the guns and the children. "You will have to shoot me first." "That can be arranged," Harlan said and raised his pistol. Then a shot rang out from the darkness, not Harlan's gun, but a rifle from the rocks above. The bullet took one of the guards in the shoulder, spinning him around. Dr. Crane stepped into the firelight, his rifle still smoking, his face set and grim. "I am done running," Crane said. "Done hiding. You want these children. You go through all of us." More of the townspeople emerged from cover, weapons raised. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they stood firm. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then a voice cut through the night, "Hold your fire." Ketchum strode into the open coat, flapping the metal lockbox chained to his wrist as always. Behind him came more guards, at least a dozen, and in the center of them, held at gunpoint, was Evangeline. "You want to play hero, Doctor?" Ketchum called. "Fine, but she dies first, then the children, then all of you. Is that what you want?" Dr. Crane's rifle wavered. "I thought not." Ketchum smiled coldly. "Now put down your weapons and step away from my property." Nayati looked at Evangeline. Blood ran from a cut above her eye, and her hands were bound, but her gaze was steady. She shook her head slightly. "Do not surrender for me." But Lottie was crying, and Franklin looked ready to fight, even though he had no weapon, and Samuel was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Nayati lowered his rifle. "Good," Ketchum said. "Now." "Wait," a small voice said. Everyone turned. Owen stepped out from behind Ketchum's guards, the wooden bird still hanging around his neck. He looked tiny and fragile in the firelight, a child caught in a war not of his making. "Please do not hurt them," Owen said, his voice shaking but clear. "Please." Ketchum looked at the boy, and something in his face crumpled. "Get back," he said roughly. "This does not concern you." "Yes, it does," Owen said. He walked forward until he stood between Ketchum and Nayati, between the guards and the children. "My mother told me that this bird was hers. She carved it before I was born. She told me that my father gave her the wood, but he left before I came. She said he never knew about me." Ketchum had gone completely still. "She told me his name." Owen continued, tears streaming down his face. "William Ketchum. She said he worked for the railroads in Chicago. She said he was kind to her once before he left." The silence was absolute. "You are him," Owen said, looking up at the Baron. "Aren't you?" Ketchum stared at the boy, at the dark hair, the gray eyes, the shape of the face that was so much like his own. His hand moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt he wore a locket. He pulled it out, opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a small lock of dark hair and a scrap of paper with a woman's handwriting, "For William, with love, Catherine." "I did not know," Ketchum whispered, his voice breaking. "She never told me. I left Chicago years before you were born. I did not know." "You know now," Owen said. "And you are hurting children. You are hurting me." Ketchum looked from the boy to the children, huddled behind Nayati, to Evangeline bleeding and bound to the guns, and the fear and the cruelty he had built. For a moment, just a moment, Nayati saw the man Ketchum might have been before the West had hardened him, before money and power had twisted everything good into something monstrous. Then the moment passed. "It does not matter," Ketchum said, his voice hardening again. "The law is on my side. These children are mine. And you," he looked at Owen, "you will come with me. I will see you raised properly, educated, given everything I can provide." "I do not want your things," Owen said. "I want to be free. You are a child. You do not know what you want. I know I do not want to be like you." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Ketchum's face went white, then red. He turned to his men. "Lock 'em all up," he said. "Every last one of them. I will sort this out in the morning." That was when the storm returned. It started as a few scattered drops, then quickly built to a downpour. Within minutes, rain was hammering down so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled through the canyon like the voice of an angry god. "Get them inside," Ketchum shouted over the roar of the storm. Now, in the confusion, Nayati saw his chance. He grabbed Lottie and Franklin and ran, pulling them toward the bridge. Tasunki and several of the townspeople followed, herding children ahead of them. Gunfire cracked through the rain, but the storm made aiming impossible. Bullets went wide, smashing into rocks and wood. The creek, already running high, was rising fast. Brown water churned and foamed, carrying branches and debris. The bridge shuddered under the onslaught, timbers groaning. Nayati got the first group of children across and then turned back. Evangeline had broken free in the chaos, her bound hands held in front of her. She ran toward the bridge, Harlan close behind. Ketchum was shouting orders, trying to organize his men, but the storm had turned everything into confusion. And then He saw Owen standing alone near the bridge, frozen with fear. "Owen!" Ketchum shouted. "Get away from there!" But the boy did not move. He stood on the bridge, rain streaming down his face, staring at the churning water below. Ketchum ran toward him, and so did Nayati. They reached the bridge at the same time, three figures in the storm, and the warrior, the baron, and the child who connected them. "Get off the bridge," Ketchum said, reaching for Owen. "It is not safe." "Nothing is safe," Owen said. "Not here, not with you." Ketchum's hand closed on the boy's arm. "You are my son. I am trying to protect you." "No," Owen said. "You are trying to own me, like you own everything else." Nayati stepped forward. "Let him go." Ketchum turned, and in his eyes was a wild desperation. "He is mine, my blood, the only thing I have left that matters." "Then let him choose," Nayati said. For a moment they stood frozen, the rain hammering down the bridge, shaking beneath them. Then a massive tree trunk slammed into the pilings. The bridge lurched violently. Jacob, one of the smallest Marchand children, had been crossing with Evangeline. The lurch sent him sliding toward a gap in the railings where planks had torn away. He screamed, small hands scrabbling for purchase. Nayati did not think. He lunged, catching Jacob just as the boy's legs went over the edge. His ribs, already cracked from earlier impacts, screamed in protest as he slammed against the railing. He held on, dragging Jacob back onto the bridge. In that moment, with Nayati's attention on saving the child, Ketchum could have run, could have escaped across the bridge with Owen disappeared into the storm with his guards and his money and his secrets. But he stood frozen, watching Nayati risk everything to save a child who was not his blood, not his responsibility, just a boy who needed saving. "You would die for them," Ketchum said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," Nayati answered, simply hauling Jacob to safety. Ketchum looked at Owen, then at the other children, then at the lockbox chained to his wrist, the box containing all his contracts, all his proof of ownership, all his carefully constructed legal justifications. "I wanted to give you everything," he said to Owen, his voice breaking. "I wanted to give you what I never had." "You could have just loved me," Owen answered. "That would have been enough." Another impact shook the bridge. One of the main support beams cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The entire structure tilted. "Everyone off!" Nayati shouted. "Now!" Evangeline grabbed children and pushed them toward solid ground. Lucille and the others pulled them to safety. But Ketchum stood in the center of the bridge, the lockbox chaining him in place, staring at his son. "Go," he said to Owen. "Go with them." "Father, go." Owen ran, and Nayati caught him, pulling the boy to safety, just as another support beam gave way. Ketchum fumbled at the chain locked to his wrist, trying to free himself. But the key was inside his coat, and his hands were shaking too badly. The weight of the lockbox iron and paper and the accumulated sins of years pulled him toward the gap in the railings. "The key," Nayati shouted. "Where is the key?" But Ketchum was not listening. He was staring at Owen, and on his face was an expression of terrible clarity, the look of a man who finally understood the true cost of everything he had done. "Tell him," Ketchum said, his voice barely audible over the roar of water and storm. "Tell him I am sorry." Then the bridge collapsed. Timbers splintered and fell. The center section dropped away, taking Ketchum with it. For a moment he was visible in the white water, one hand reaching up the lockbox, dragging him down. Then the current took him, and he was gone, pulled under by the weight of his own greed, his own carefully documented crimes. The water churned brown and terrible and gave nothing back. The rain slowed, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The clouds broke, and pale moonlight, filtered through, turning the canyon silver and black. Nayati stood at the edge of the broken bridge, breathing hard, one arm wrapped around his cracked ribs. The children were gathered behind him, all of them miraculously alive. Evangeline was cutting the ropes from her wrists with a knife someone had given her. Dr. Crane was checking each child methodically, looking for injuries. Owen stood apart, staring at the water where his father had vanished. Nayati walked over and knelt beside the boy. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "He was not a good man." Owen said, his voice empty. "Was he?" "No," Nayati answered, because the boy deserved truth. "But he was your father. And I think at the end, he wanted to be better. That counts for something." "Does it?" "I do not know," Nayati admitted. "But I hope so." Owen's hand went to the wooden bird around his neck, the only thing his mother had left him. "He looked at this when he first saw me. At the train depot. That is when he knew. That is when he recognized it." "Did he say anything?" "He told the men to keep me separate, to give me better food. But he never told me who he was. He never said." The boy's voice broke. "He never said he was my father." "He was afraid," Nayati said. "Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of what he would have to change. So he kept me in a cage instead." "Yes." Owen was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to where Evangeline stood with the other children. She opened her arms, and he went to her, finally letting himself cry. By dawn, Ketchum's men had scattered. Some fled up the canyon. Others, seeing their employer dead and their wages uncertain, simply walked away. A few of the guards, who had been conscripted more than hired, helped the townspeople organize the camp's other occupants, 24 children who had been working in the mine or kept in the bunkhouses, some for years. In the office building, they found Ketchum's records. Not just the lockbox that had drowned with him, but backup ledgers, correspondence contracts. Everything Dr. Crane had documented, and more: names, ages, payments received, placements made. Children tracked like livestock, their lives reduced to columns of profit and loss. Lucille gathered it all carefully, her hands shaking with fury and grief. "This goes to every newspaper from here to Washington," she said. "Every territorial official, every judge. This ends now, all of it." The journey back to Drought Creek took 3 days. The children were weak, some of them sick, all of them traumatized. They moved slowly, stopping frequently, letting the little ones rest. Along the way, people came out from homesteads and small settlements to help women, bringing food men, offering wagons to carry those who could not walk, families opening their homes for a night's shelter. Word had spread, somehow carried by telegraph and rumor, and the kind of story that people needed to believe in. Lesson that children had been saved, that a tyrant had fallen, that good people had stood up when it mattered. By the time they reached Drought Creek, a crowd was waiting. Not a mob, but a gathering, people who had heard, who wanted to help, who brought blankets and food and offers of homes. Marshal Jenkins was there too, looking older and grayer than before. He had been in contact with the territorial authorities, he said. Federal marshals were on their way to investigate Coal Creek fully. There would be a hearing. Questions would be asked. "And us?" Nayati asked quietly. "Will we be charged?" Jenkins was quiet for a moment. "I will testify that you acted to save lives in imminent danger," he said finally. "Beyond that, I cannot say. But Nayati, what you did was right, no matter what the law says. It was not much, but it was something." The children were taken to the schoolhouse, which Lucille had transformed into a temporary shelter. Dr. Crane examined each one, treating injuries, dosing out medicine, talking quietly to those who could not sleep. Owen stayed close to Evangeline, following her like a shadow. Late that night, after the children had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Evangeline found Nayati sitting on the schoolhouse steps, staring at the stars. She sat down beside him without speaking. For a long time, they just sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from surviving something terrible together. "Thank you," she said finally. "You have thanked me enough." "Not for saving me?" She looked at him. "For keeping your promise. To Lottie, to all of them. You said you would bring them back, and you did." "We did," he corrected. "All of us." She smiled slightly. "Yes, all of us." He turned to look at her, seeing the bruises on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce strength that had carried her through nightmare after nightmare without breaking. "Evangeline," he said quietly. "Yes. When this is over, when the hearings are done and the children are settled, I would like—" He paused, searching for words in English that did not quite capture what he meant. "I would like to court you, properly, with respect, if you would allow it." She stared at him, and for a moment he thought he had misread. Everything had mistaken shared survival for something deeper. Then she smiled a real smile that lit her whole face. "I would like that very much." He took her hand carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. She laced her fingers through his and held on. Inside the schoolhouse, Lottie peeked through the window and grinned. She had seen enough loss. It was time to see something good. Weeks became months. The federal investigation into Ketchum's operation was thorough and damning. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the Coal Creek scandal, and the Orphan Train Society, humiliated and horrified, announced sweeping reforms. Mandatory local oversight committees, regular inspections by federal authorities, criminal penalties for exploitation. Dr. Crane testified at the hearings, laying out his complicity in careful, painful detail. He surrendered his medical license voluntarily and awaited the judge's decision on criminal charges. In the end, the judge ruled that Crane's cooperation and his ultimate actions in saving the children warranted mercy. He would not face jail time. But his medical career was over. "I can live with that," Crane said when the verdict came down. "As long as those children live." The territorial court convened in Drought Creek's small courthouse to determine the fate of the rescued children. The room was packed with reporters, officials, and townspeople. Evangeline testified, first describing the orphan train, the depot, everything that had happened. Her testimony was clear and devastating. Then Lottie took the stand, and even the hardest men in the room found themselves blinking back tears as she described life in the bunkhouse at Coal Creek. The fear, the hunger, the way hope had slowly bled away until Nayati and Evangeline came back for them. When she finished, she did something no one expected. She pulled out a piece of paper, a petition she had written in careful script and gotten all 7 Marchand children to sign along with Owen and several of the other rescued children. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we petition this court to let us stay together, all of us, with Miss Evangeline and Mr. Nayati. They saved us. They are our family now." The judge, a stern man in his 60s, who had seen everything the frontier could offer, read the petition slowly. When he looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "The law," he said carefully, "does not always account for what the heart knows to be right. Legally, I cannot grant this petition as written. I cannot place white children in the guardianship of a Lakota scout and an immigrant widow with no formal standing." Lottie's face fell. Evangeline reached for Nayati's hand. "However," the judge continued, "there are other ways. The county will establish a proper children's home here in Drought Creek, overseen by a legally qualified guardian. I hereby appoint Miss Lucille Hart to that position in recognition of her service character and the testimony of dozens of witnesses." Lucille stood nodding. "I accept your honor. Miss Hart, you will require staff for this home, a matron to manage the household and care for the children day to day." "I do, your honor. I propose Mrs. Evangeline Marchand for that position." "Approved. And you will require someone to maintain the property, provide security, and manage external affairs." "I propose Nayati, your honor. A scout, a warrior, and a man who has proven his character beyond any reasonable doubt." "Approved." The judge banged his gavel. "The Drought Creek Children's Home is hereby established under the supervision of Miss Lucille Hart, with Mrs. Marchand and Nayati as staff. All children rescued from the Coal Creek operation are hereby placed in the care of this home until such time as proper families can be found, with the understanding that some children may choose to remain as part of the household if they wish." He looked directly at Lottie. "The law may not call you a family, young lady, but I do." The courtroom erupted in applause. They built the home using money confiscated from Ketchum's estate and a piece of land Nayati had quietly leased along the river, good land despite what the agency had claimed. The work took weeks, and everyone helped. The building rose slowly, a long, low structure with a deep porch, sturdy shutters, and a stone fireplace big enough to heat the whole house. The children worked alongside the adults, learning carpentry and masonry, and the satisfaction of building something that would last. Franklin proved to have a gift for measuring and cutting timber. Lottie organized the younger children into teams that carried water and sorted nails. Owen, quiet but determined, worked side by side with Nayati, learning to set posts and stretch fence wire. On the day they raised the last stretch of fence, the sky was clear and blue. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh-cut wood. The river ran high, but calm, sparkling in the late summer light. Evangeline wrestled with a stubborn corner post that refused to sink straight. Nayati came up behind her, wordlessly closing his larger hands over hers on the tamping bar. Together, they drove it deep, the post settling firm and true into the earth. "There," he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. "That will hold." She turned in the circle of his arms, looking up at him. They had been careful over the past months, respectful, proper, always conscious of watching eyes and propriety. But now, with the fence done and the house built and the future spread out before them like the prairie, something shifted. "Nayati," she said quietly. "Yes. I think it is time we made this courtship official. Do you not?" He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually solemn face. "I was waiting for you to say so." He kissed her, then gentle and careful, and the children who had been watching from the porch erupted in cheers and laughter. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, they gathered on the porch, all of them. Lucille, Evangeline, Nayati, and 19 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers. The Marchand 7 plus Owen plus others who had been rescued from Coal Creek and chosen to stay rather than go to distant families they did not know. They sat together, watching the light fade, passing around cups of cider and plates of cornbread, telling stories and jokes, learning what it meant to be safe. Owen sat between Evangeline and Nayati, the wooden bird still around his neck. He had not spoken much about his father since that night on the bridge. But tonight, as the stars began to appear, he looked up at Nayati. "Do you think he loved me?" he asked quietly. At the end, Nayati considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said finally. "I think he did. But he loved his empire more, and that was his tragedy. Love should not have to compete with greed. It should win always." Owen nodded slowly, seeming to accept that. "I am glad I am here," he said, "with all of you." So are we, Evangeline said, pulling him close. Lottie, sitting on the porch rail with Samuel in her lap, looked at Nayati. You kept your promise, she said. You said you would not leave us, and you did not. I will never leave you, Nayati answered. None of you. You have my word. And this time, it was a promise he knew he could keep. 3 months later, in the small white church at the end of Drought Creek's main street, Nayati and Evangeline were married. The ceremony was simple, attended by the children, Lucille, Dr. Crane, half the town, and a dozen Lakota from Nayati's band, who rode in for the occasion. The preacher, a young man new to the territory, asked if there were any objections. 19 children shouted "No" so loudly that the rafters rang, and everyone laughed. Afterward, there was a feast on the grounds of the children's home. Tables laden with food music from fiddles and a borrowed piano dancing that lasted until the stars came out. The children ran wild with joy, finally free to be children again. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Nayati and Evangeline stood by the fence line, watching the last light fade from the sky. Her hand was in his, her head resting against his shoulder. Do you ever think about what might have been? She asked quietly. If we had not found them that night, if you had ridden past in the storm. Every day, he admitted. And every day, I am grateful I did not. So am I. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the children's laughter floating from the house, feeling the solid earth beneath their feet, and the future stretching out before them, like a promise. In the distance, thunder rumbled, but it was only heat thunder, a memory of storms past. The sky remained clear, and the stars came out one by one, hard and bright and eternal. It will hold, Nayati said, looking at the fence, the house, the family they had built from wreckage and hope. Yes, Evangeline answered, tightening her hand in his. It will, and it did. Years later, when the territorial newspapers ran stories about the reforms in the orphan train system, they often mentioned the Drought Creek Children's Home as an example of what could be done right. Dozens of children passed through its doors, found safety, learned trades, and went on to build lives of their own. Some stayed, choosing to make Drought Creek their permanent home. Others left but wrote letters, keeping in touch, sending news of marriages and children and successes. The home became a hub, a center, a place where family was defined not by blood, but by choice and love, and the fierce determination to protect what mattered. Lottie grew up to become a teacher herself, taking over the schoolhouse from Lucille when the older woman finally retired. Franklin became a carpenter, building homes across the territory with the same careful precision he had learned setting fence posts. Owen studied law and devoted his career to children's advocacy, ensuring that what happened at Coal Creek could never happen again. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, Nayati and Evangeline would sit on the porch of the home they had built, hands intertwined, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. They had both lost so much: Nayati, his sister, and his innocence; Evangeline, her homeland and her family. But they had found something too, something harder and more valuable than anything they had lost: a home built not on blood or law or paper, but on the simple, radical act of choosing to love and protect those who needed it most. The prairie stretched out before them, wild and beautiful and free. And somewhere in the distance, a child laughed the sound, carrying on the wind like a promise kept.